The gunshot that split the Wyoming morning air sent every living creature within a mile diving for cover, except for the woman kneeling beside the creek, who did not even flinch but continued humming a melody so strange and haunting that Yates Reilly forgot entirely why he had drawn his revolver in the first place. He had been tracking a wounded deer through the cottonwoods outside Laramie, following the blood trail down to the water's edge where the September sunlight caught the ripples in a thousand dancing fragments. And there she was, this slip of a woman with copper hair falling loose down her back, her hands busy with laundry in the cold running water, her voice lifting and falling in a tune that seemed older than the mountains themselves. Yates holstered his weapon slowly, careful not to startle her, though she showed no sign of having heard him approach, despite his boots crunching through the dried grass and his accidental discharge when he had stumbled over a half-buried rock. The deer had vanished, leaving only a few spots of crimson on the stones, but Yates found he no longer cared about losing his quarry. He stood there in the dappled shade, hat in hand, without realizing he had removed it, listening to this woman's song that pulled at something deep in his chest, something he had thought the war and the years of drifting had beaten out of him entirely. When she finally paused to wring out a cotton shirt, he cleared his throat. She turned then, and he saw a face that would have been unremarkable in its plainness, except for the eyes, which were the exact color of sagebrush in spring rain, and held an intelligence that seemed to see straight through to his bones. She could not have been more than 22 or 23, he guessed, though there was something ageless in her expression that made such calculations feel meaningless. "That is a beautiful song," Yates said, and his own voice sounded strange to him, rougher than usual. "I have never heard anything quite like it." The woman studied him for a long moment, her wet hands dripping onto the hem of her faded calico dress. "My grandmother taught me before she died," she said simply. "She learned it from her grandmother, and so on back through the years. I do not suppose anyone else alive knows it now." There was such loneliness in those words, spoken matter-of-factly as they were, that Yates felt something crack open inside him. He stepped closer to the creek bank, keeping his movements slow and unthreatening. "I am sorry for disturbing your peace. My gun went off by accident. I hope I did not frighten you." A small smile touched the corners of her mouth. "I grew up in Kansas during the border wars. It takes more than a gunshot to frighten me, Mr. Reilly." He blinked in surprise. "How did you know my name?" "You work at the Sullivan Ranch, do you not? I have seen you in town, though we have never been introduced. I am Ophelia Hayes." She wiped her hands on her apron and offered one to him across the narrow span of water. Yates found himself stepping right into the creek, cold water flooding his boots, to take her hand properly. Her grip was firm, and her palm calloused from hard work. "Pleased to make your acquaintance, Miss Hayes. Though I confess you have me at a disadvantage. I surely would have remembered seeing you." "I keep to myself mostly," Ophelia said, releasing his hand and returning to her laundry. "I work for Mrs. Chen at the boarding house, doing washing and mending. It does not bring me into town much." Yates knew Mrs. Chen's establishment, a respectable place that catered to single working men and traveling salesmen. He had stayed there briefly when he first arrived in Laramie 8 months ago, before Thomas Sullivan had offered him steady work managing the horse-breaking operation. "That is hard work for a woman alone," he observed. Ophelia shrugged as she lifted a sheet from the water and began twisting it to remove the excess. "I do not mind hard work. It keeps my hands busy and my mind occupied." There was a story there, Yates knew, layers of loss and survival that she kept close to her chest. He recognized it because he carried his own such stories, things he did not speak of to the other ranch hands or even to Sullivan, who had been kinder to him than he deserved. The war had ended 11 years ago in 1865, but for men like Yates, who had fought for the Confederacy and lost everything in the process, the scars remained fresh. "Would you teach it to me?" The words left his mouth before his brain had fully formed the thought. "The song, I mean. if it would not be disrespectful to your grandmother's memory. Ophelia paused in her ringing and looked at him with those penetrating sage green eyes. Why would you want to learn it? Yates thought about this, really thought about it instead of just speaking to fill the silence. Because something that beautiful should not be lost, he said finally. Because you said no one else knows it, and that strikes me as a terrible shame. Because I have not heard anything in a long time that made me feel the way your singing just did. The last admission cost him something. He could feel it in the tightness of his throat, but Ophelia's expression softened in response. It is not an easy tune, she warned. My grandmother said it came from the old country, from Ireland before the famine drove our people across the ocean. She said it was sung at wakes and weddings both, because it speaks of endings and beginnings tangled up together. I would still like to try, Yates said. Ophelia considered this while she hung the sheet over a low branch to drain. The fabric stirred in the breeze, clean and white against the golden leaves. Very well, she said at last. But not today. I have work to finish, and you are standing in a creek in your boots like a fool, which suggests you should probably get back to whatever you were doing before you found me. Yates looked down at his submerged feet and laughed, actually laughed, which was something he could not remember doing in months. You make a fair point, Miss Hayes. When would you be willing to give me a lesson? Sunday afternoon, she said. I have 3 hours free between finishing the noon meal and starting supper preparations. Meet me here at 2 o'clock if you are serious about this. I will be here, Yates promised, and he meant it with an intensity that surprised him. He squelched his way out of the creek and back up the bank, retrieving his hat from where it had fallen in the grass. When he looked back, Ophelia had returned to her washing, but she was humming again, and the melody followed him all the way back through the cottonwoods to where he had left his horse tied to a scrub pine. The deer was long gone, but Yates found he did not mind returning to the Sullivan Ranch empty-handed. He had found something far more valuable than venison in those woods by the water. Thomas Sullivan raised an eyebrow when Yates appeared at the evening meal with ruined boots and no game to show for his morning in the hills, but the older man was decent enough not to ask questions. Sullivan was a transplant from Boston who had come west for his health 20 years ago and built a successful ranch through shrewdness and hard work. He employed 6 permanent hands, plus seasonal help during roundup and calving, and he treated them all fairly, which was more than could be said for most ranchers in the territory. That night in the bunkhouse, Yates lay on his narrow cot and stared at the ceiling beams while the other men played cards and traded stories. He could still hear Ophelia's song in his head, that strange wandering melody that seemed to have no clear beginning or end, just phrases that circled back on themselves like a snake eating its tail. He wondered what the words might be, if there were words, and what language they would be sung in. He wondered what had brought Ophelia Hayes to Laramie, Wyoming, working in a boarding house laundry when she had the bearing and speech of someone who had received at least some education. Saturday passed in the usual round of ranch work. Yates spent the morning in the breaking pen with a 3-year-old gelding that had more spirit than sense, and the afternoon helping to repair a section of fence that had been knocked down by a wandering buffalo. Sullivan's ranch was situated at the edge of open range, and they still saw the great beasts occasionally, though their numbers had diminished drastically since the railroad came through 5 years ago. The work was good, honest, and exhausting, and it left little room for thinking, which Yates usually appreciated. Today, though, he found his mind wandering back to the woman by the creek and the promise of Sunday afternoon. Sunday morning dawned clear and cool, with frost on the grass that melted quickly once the sun climbed above the Medicine Bow Mountains to the east. Yates attended services in town, something he did sporadically at best, and scanned the congregation for copper hair and sage green eyes. He did not see Ophelia among the worshippers at the Methodist church, nor when he walked past the Catholic church afterward to see who was emerging from that service. Perhaps she attended neither, or perhaps she was simply too busy with her duties at the boarding house to spare time for Sunday worship. He ate a quick lunch at the Laramie Hotel dining room. too anxious to return to the ranch and endure the other hand's good-natured ribbing about his Sunday habits. Instead, he arrived at the creek an hour early and spent the time pacing the bank like a nervous schoolboy, checking and rechecking his pocket watch. He had worn his best shirt, the blue one that did not have any patches, and his second pair of boots, since his everyday ones were still drying out from their unexpected dunking. He had even trimmed his beard, which had grown somewhat wild over the summer months. Ophelia appeared at precisely 2 o'clock, emerging from the trees on the opposite side of the creek like a forest spirit taking human form. She had changed from her work dress into something slightly nicer, a green print that brought out the color of her eyes, and she had braided her hair in a thick plait that hung over one shoulder. She carried a small basket covered with a checkered cloth. "You came," she said, and there was surprise in her voice, as if she had not really expected him to keep his word. "I said I would," Yates replied, feeling slightly offended that she had doubted him. Ophelia smiled, a real smile this time that transformed her face entirely. "Many people say things they do not mean. I have learned not to count on words alone." She settled herself on a flat rock near the water's edge and gestured for Yates to join her. He sat carefully, very aware of the small space between them, and the way her shoulder nearly brushed his when she leaned to set down her basket. Up close, he could see the faint scatter of freckles across her nose, and the way her eyelashes caught the light like copper wire. "My grandmother's name was Siobhan," Ophelia began without preamble. "She was born in County Cork in 1798 and lived through things I cannot even imagine. The rebellion, the famine, the coffin ships that brought the survivors to America. She married my grandfather in New York City in 1849, and they moved west to Kansas to claim land under the Homestead Act. She was 65 years old and tough as leather, and she could outwork men half her age in the fields." Yates listened, recognizing the cadence of a story that needed to be told before the lesson could begin. Ophelia's voice had taken on a dreamy quality, her gaze fixed on the moving water, as if she could see her grandmother's face reflected there. "She taught me everything she knew," Ophelia continued. "How to grow vegetables in stubborn soil, how to preserve food for the winter, how to deliver a calf and set a broken bone and shoot a rifle straight. But most of all, she taught me songs. She said that songs were the one thing no one could take from you, the one possession that traveled light. She had hundreds of them in her head, ballads and work songs and lullabies, all passed down through generations of women who had survived impossible things." "What happened to her?" Yates asked gently when Ophelia fell silent. "She died when I was 17, Ophelia said. Pneumonia took her one bitter winter. She was 83 and still working every day until the fever laid her low. I sat with her those last 3 days, and she sang to me even when her voice was barely a whisper. This song was the last one she taught me, the night before she passed. She said it was the oldest one she knew, that it had come down from before Christianity even reached Ireland, from the old Druids who worshipped in groves and knew the language of birds. The weight of that inheritance hung in the air between them. Yates understood that Ophelia was not just offering to teach him a tune, but inviting him into a sacred space, a keeping place for memory and loss and survival. "I will do my best to honor it," he said quietly. Ophelia met his eyes and nodded. "I believe you will." She began to hum then, that same haunting melody he had heard 2 days ago, and this time he listened with full attention, trying to catch the structure of it, the way the phrases rose and fell and circled back. When she had gone through it twice, she stopped and said, "Now you try." Yates had never considered himself musical. He could carry a tune well enough around a campfire, but nothing fancy. Still, he attempted to recreate what he had heard, stumbling over the intervals and losing the thread halfway through. Ophelia corrected him patiently, breaking the melody down into smaller pieces, making him repeat each section until he had it right. They worked for 2 hours straight, hardly aware of the time passing. Ophelia proved to be an exacting but encouraging teacher, quick to praise when he got something right and gentle in her corrections when he faltered. Yates found himself wholly absorbed in the task, in the challenge of mastering this strange and lovely music, in the pleasure of sitting close to this woman who smelled faintly of soap and lavender. When his pocket watch chimed 4 o'clock, Ophelia stood reluctantly. I must get back. Mrs. Chen will need help with supper preparations. Yates rose as well, brushing dirt from his trousers. May I walk with you part of the way? Ophelia hesitated, then nodded. As far as the edge of town, I do not want to give people reason to talk. They walked in companionable silence through the cottonwood grove and up the gradual slope toward Laramie's outskirts. The town had grown considerably since the Union Pacific Railroad came through in 1868, transforming it from a rough construction camp into a proper settlement with churches and schools and a permanent population approaching 2,000 souls. It was still rough around the edges, as all frontier towns were, but it had aspirations toward respectability. At the point where the dirt track widened into a proper street, Ophelia paused. Thank you for today, she said. It has been a long time since I shared my grandmother's songs with anyone. Thank you for trusting me with them, Yates replied. Will you continue teaching me? I feel I have only scratched the surface. Ophelia's expression was unreadable. You would come back next Sunday? I would come back every Sunday for as long as you are willing to teach me, Yates said, and the words came out more intense than he had intended. Something flickered in Ophelia's eyes. Hope, maybe, or fear, or some combination of the two. Next Sunday, then, she agreed. Same time, same place. Yates watched her walk away up the street, her basket swinging at her side, until she turned a corner and disappeared from view. Then he headed back toward the Sullivan Ranch, humming under his breath, that ancient Irish melody tangling with the clip-clop of his boots on the hard-packed road. The pattern established itself over the following weeks. Every Sunday afternoon, Yates met Ophelia by the creek, and she taught him more of her grandmother's songs. There was the Blackbird's Lullaby, which Siobhan had sung to Ophelia's mother as a baby, and the Weaver's Lament, which told the story of a woman whose lover went to sea and never returned, and the Three Riddles, which was more spoken than sung and required intricate wordplay that made Yates's head spin. But they did more than just share music. They talked hesitantly at first and then with increasing openness about their lives and histories. Yates learned that Ophelia had been born in Kansas in 1853, that her father had died when she was 12, kicked in the head by a plow horse, and her mother had remarried quickly to a man who had no patience for a stepdaughter. When Ophelia turned 18, she had taken what little money her grandmother left her and bought a ticket west, as far from her stepfather as the railroad would carry her. In turn, Yates told Ophelia about growing up on a tobacco farm in Virginia, about joining the Confederate Army at 17 full of stupid idealism, about the things he had seen at Antietam and Gettysburg that still visited him in nightmares. He told her about coming home to find the farm burned and his parents dead of fever, about the years of drifting from town to town, doing whatever work he could find, always moving, never settling, until he had landed in Laramie and Thomas Sullivan had offered him something resembling a future. Why did you stop? Ophelia asked one October afternoon when the aspens had turned gold and the air carried the first real bite of coming winter. What made you stay here instead of moving on? Yates considered this. Exhaustion, maybe. Or maybe I just finally got tired of running from ghosts. Sullivan is a good man, and the work is honest. It seemed as good a place as any to plant my feet for a while. And now? Ophelia pressed. Are you still just stopping for a while? Or are you staying? The question carried weight beyond its simple words. Yates looked at her, really looked at her, seeing not just the plain face and the work-worn hands, but the fierce intelligence and the deep well of strength that had brought her through loss and hardship without breaking. Somewhere over these past weeks of Sundays, she had become essential to him, as necessary as breath. I am staying, he said firmly. For as long as you will let me. Ophelia's eyes shimmered with sudden tears. I have nothing to offer you, Yates. No family, no property, no prospects. I am just a laundress working for a Chinese widow in a frontier town. You have yourself, Yates said, reaching across the space between them to take her hand. You have these songs and your grandmother's strength and the kindest heart I have ever known. That is more than enough for me. She let him hold her hand, her fingers tightening around his. I am frightened, she admitted in a whisper. I have lost everyone I have ever loved. I do not know if I can bear to open my heart again. I am frightened too, Yates confessed. I have spent the last 11 years making sure I never cared about anything enough to be hurt when I lost it. But Ophelia, I think we are both tired of being frightened. I think we have earned the right to try for something better. The kiss, when it came, was soft and tentative, a question more than a declaration. But when Ophelia leaned into him, her hand coming up to rest against his jaw, Yates felt something locked inside his chest finally, blessedly break open. They sat there by the creek, as the afternoon light slanted golden through the cottonwoods, learning the taste and texture of each other, taking the first trembling steps toward hope. They courted properly after that, or as properly as frontier life allowed. Yates called on Ophelia at the boarding house on Sunday evenings, sitting stiffly in Mrs. Chen's parlor under the widow's watchful eye, making awkward conversation while his heart hammered against his ribs. He brought Ophelia small gifts, nothing extravagant because he had little money to spare, but thoughtful things. A hair ribbon in sage green that matched her eyes, a book of poetry he had seen her admiring in the mercantile window, a jar of honey from a homesteader who kept bees on the edge of town. Mrs. Chen approved of the courtship, which was important because she functioned as Ophelia's unofficial guardian and protector. The widow was a formidable woman in her 50s who had come to California during the gold rush with her husband and ended up in Laramie after he died building the railroad. She ran her boarding house with an iron hand and a shrewd business sense, and she had taken Ophelia under her wing when the younger woman arrived in town 3 years ago with nowhere else to turn. You treat her right, Mrs. Chen told Yates one evening when Ophelia had gone to fetch tea. Her English was accented but clear. She is good girl, work hard, never complain. She deserve good man. I will do my best to be worthy of her, Yates promised, and he meant it. Thomas Sullivan noticed the change in his horse trainer and approved as well, though he expressed it differently. You have been whistling while you work, he observed one morning in late October. I do not believe I have ever heard you whistle before. Yates felt his face heat. I apologize if it disturbs you, sir. Sullivan laughed and clapped him on the shoulder. Disturb me? Son, it makes me happy to see you coming alive again. You have been a ghost ever since you arrived here, going through the motions. Now you look like a man with a reason to wake up in the morning. I suppose I am, Yates admitted. Sir, I was wondering if I might ask your advice on a matter of some importance. Sullivan's expression turned serious. Of course. Walk with me. They left the breaking pen and strolled toward the pasture where Sullivan's breeding mares grazed with their foals. The October morning was crisp and bright, the kind of day that made Yates grateful to be alive despite everything. He struggled to find the right words, but Sullivan waited patiently, giving him time. I want to ask Miss Hayes to marry me, Yates said finally, but I have very little to offer her. My wages are fair, but I have no land, no house, no savings to speak of. Is it wrong to propose when I cannot promise her anything better than what she already has? Sullivan was quiet for a long moment, leaning against the fence rail and watching the horses. I came west with nothing but the clothes on my back and enough money for 6 months' room and board, he said at last. I was dying, or so the doctors told me. Consumption, they said, and they gave me a year at most. That was in 1856. Yates knew Sullivan was healthy now, robust even, But he had never heard the full story. He listened intently as his employer continued. I met my wife Elizabeth on the stagecoach from Denver to Laramie. She was a school teacher heading west to take a position in the territorial schools. We talked for 3 days straight, and by the time we arrived here, I knew I wanted to spend whatever time I had left with her. I proposed after knowing her for 2 weeks. I told her I was dying and had nothing to give her but heartbreak, and she said yes anyway. Sullivan smiled at the memory, his eyes distant. She died in childbirth 5 years later, her and the baby both. I thought it would kill me too, the grief of it, but I kept going because that is what she would have wanted. I built this ranch with my bare hands in her memory, every fence post and barn beam a testament to what we had together, however brief. He turned to look at Yates directly. My point is this. We none of us know how much time we have. The only real mistake is wasting the time we do have by being too cautious to live. If you love Miss Hayes and she loves you, then ask her. Figure out the rest as you go. Thank you, sir, Yates said, his throat tight. That means more than you know. Sullivan nodded. As it happens, I have a proposition that might ease your financial concerns. My foreman wants to retire next spring and move to California to be near his daughter. I would like to offer you the position. It comes with a significant increase in wages and the use of the small house on the north section of the property. It needs work, but it is sound and it would give you and a wife some privacy. Yates felt his heart leap. The foreman's house was a modest 2-room cabin, but it had its own well and a small barn and enough land for a kitchen garden. It was more than he had dared dream of. Sir, I do not know what to say. Are you certain? Some of the other hands have been with you longer. None of them have your way with horses or your steady head, Sullivan said firmly. I have watched you these past months, Yates. You are the kind of man I want helping me run this place. Do we have an agreement? Yes, sir. Absolutely yes. Yates shook Sullivan's offered hand, gripping hard. Good. Now I suggest you go into town and talk to the jeweler about a ring. I hear Miss Hayes has a Sunday afternoon free this coming week. Yates did exactly that. He spent nearly every dollar he had saved on a simple gold band set with a small garnet, Ophelia's birthstone, as he had learned from Mrs. Chin. It was not much, but it was honest, and it was given with his whole heart. On Sunday afternoon, with the first snow of the season dusting the mountains and the creek running cold and clear, Yates met Ophelia at their usual spot. She was humming one of her grandmother's songs, The Rowan Tree, and she smiled when she saw him approaching. You look nervous, she observed. Are you well? I am about to be much better, or much worse, Yates said, and his voice only shook a little. He took her hands in his, feeling them trembling, or maybe that was his own hands shaking. Ophelia, these past months with you have been the best of my life. You have taught me that I can still hope, still dream, still believe in a future worth building. I love you more than I thought it was possible to love anyone, and I want to spend the rest of my life learning your grandmother's songs and making new memories with you. He dropped to one knee in the frost-stiff grass, pulling the small box from his pocket. Will you marry me? Ophelia's hands flew to her mouth, her eyes wide and bright with tears. Oh, Yates, yes, yes, of course, yes. He stood and slipped the ring onto her finger, and it fit perfectly, the garnet glowing deep red in the autumn sunlight. Then he kissed her properly, pouring 11 years of loneliness and loss, and finally hope into the press of his mouth against hers. She kissed him back with equal fervor, her arms wrapping around his neck, and for a long moment the whole world was just the two of them and the sound of the creek and the ancient melody she had been humming. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Ophelia laughed through her tears. I have something to tell you as well. Mrs. Chen has offered to sell me the boarding house. She wants to retire and move to San Francisco to live with her sister, and she says if I can raise half the money, she will carry a loan for the rest. It is a good business, Yates. We could make a real living from it. Yates felt his excitement dim slightly. Sullivan has offered me the foreman position and the use of a house on the ranch. I had hoped we could make our home there. Ophelia bit her lip, thinking, could you do both? Work at the ranch during the day and come home to town in the evenings? It is not that far, only an hour's ride. I suppose I could, Yates said slowly, but that would leave you managing the boarding house alone most of the time. That is a heavy burden. I have been managing it alone for 3 years already, Ophelia pointed out. Mrs. Chen handles the finances and the difficult lodgers, but I do all the actual work. And if we owned it outright, we could make our own decisions. We could build something together, Yates. Something that belongs to us. He saw the fire in her eyes, the determination that had carried her across half a continent alone at 18 years old. This was important to her, this independence, this chance to own something outright in a world that offered women few such opportunities. How could he deny her that? Then we will do both, he said firmly. I will work for Sullivan during the day and come home to you at night, and on my days off, I will help you with whatever you need at the boarding house. We will build our future together, brick by brick if we have to. Ophelia's smile was radiant. Have I told you that I love you? Because I do, Yates Reilly. I love you so much it frightens me. I love you too, he said, kissing her forehead, her cheeks, the tip of her nose. And I promise you, Ophelia Hayes, I am not going anywhere. You are stuck with me now. They were married 6 weeks later in a quiet ceremony at the Methodist Church, with Mrs. Chen and Thomas Sullivan standing as witnesses. Ophelia wore a dress of deep green velvet that Mrs. Chen had helped her sew, and Yates wore a new suit purchased for the occasion. The minister's words washed over them like a benediction, and when Yates slipped the matching gold band onto Ophelia's finger beside her engagement ring, he felt the past finally, truly release its hold on him. The wedding breakfast was held at the boarding house, with Mrs. Chen cooking a feast that drew appreciative noises from the dozen guests in attendance. There were men from the Sullivan Ranch, including the current foreman, who clapped Yates on the back and welcomed him to the job. There were a few of the boarding house's permanent lodgers, respectable clerks and shop owners who had come to know and respect Ophelia. And there was the jeweler who had sold Yates the rings, and the minister and his wife, and the owner of the mercantile where Ophelia did her shopping. It was a small gathering, but it was genuine, and as Yates looked around the table at these people who had become something like family to him and his new wife, he felt wealthy beyond measure. Mrs. Chen had given them the boarding house's best room for their wedding night, the large corner one with windows facing both east and south, and a real brass bedstead instead of the simple rope frame beds in the other rooms. She had also, bless her, made herself scarce, retiring to a friend's house for the evening to give the newlyweds privacy. Ophelia stood by the window in her green dress, backlit by the last rays of sunset, and Yates thought his heart might burst from the simple beauty of the moment. He crossed the room slowly and wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his chin on top of her head. "Hello, wife," he murmured. He felt her laugh, the vibration of it traveling through both their bodies. "Hello, husband." They stood like that for a long moment, watching the light fade from the sky and the first stars appear over the mountains. Then Ophelia turned in his arms and looked up at him, her sage green eyes dark in the dimming light. "I am nervous," she admitted. "Is that foolish?" "Not at all," Yates said gently. "I am nervous too. We will figure it out together, yes?" She nodded and rose on her toes to kiss him. The kiss deepened naturally, inevitably, and Yates felt desire kindle in his belly, warm and urgent. He was not a virgin. There had been a few encounters over the years with women whose names he no longer remembered, but this felt entirely different. This was his wife, his Ophelia, and every touch carried the weight of promise and permanence. They undressed each other slowly in the gathering dark, learning the landscape of each other's bodies with hands and lips and whispered endearments. When they finally came together in the big brass bed, it was with a tenderness that brought tears to both their eyes. They moved together slowly, finding their rhythm, and when they reached their peak, it was in unison, crying out softly into each other's mouths. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the sheets, Ophelia's head resting on Yates's chest, his fingers tracing idle patterns on her bare shoulder. The room had grown fully dark, and the only light came from the street lamps outside. Yates? Ophelia said after a while. Yes, love. Thank you for not giving up on me. On us. I know I made it difficult at first, keeping my distance. Yates kissed the top of her head. You were protecting yourself. I understand that better than anyone. But you let me in eventually, and that is all that matters. Ophelia propped herself up on one elbow to look at him. Will you sing for me? One of my grandmother's songs? So Yates sang The Blackbird's Lullaby in his rough but honest voice, stumbling over some of the more complicated phrases but getting through it well enough. When he finished, Ophelia was smiling through tears. She would have liked you, she said. My grandmother. She always said a good man was worth his weight in gold, and you are the best man I know. I am just a man, Yates protested. Flawed and ordinary. No, Ophelia said firmly. You are extraordinary. You are brave and kind, and you make me believe in tomorrow. Do not ever let me hear you say otherwise. Yates pulled her back down against his chest. Overwhelmed with emotion, they fell asleep like that, wrapped in each other. And for the first time in 11 years, Yates slept through the night without nightmares. The winter that followed was hard but good. Mrs. Chen finalized the sale of the boarding house in January, signing the papers over to Ophelia and Yates with tears in her eyes and strict instructions that they must write to her in San Francisco and tell her how the business fared. Ophelia proved to be as capable an owner as she had been an employee, managing the books and the lodgers with equal efficiency while also maintaining the high standards of cleanliness and cooking that had made the establishment successful. Yates threw himself into his new position as foreman at the Sullivan Ranch, rising before dawn to make the ride out to the property, and often not returning until after dark. It was exhausting, juggling the two responsibilities, but it was also deeply satisfying. He was building something, contributing to something larger than himself, and the paycheck from Sullivan combined with the boarding house income meant that he and Ophelia were financially secure. For the first time in either of their lives, they settled into a rhythm, these two wounded people learning to be whole together. On the nights when Yates made it home at a reasonable hour, they would sit together in their private quarters on the boarding house's second floor, and Ophelia would teach him more of her grandmother's songs while he worked on mending tack or sharpening tools. On Sundays, they still went to their creek when weather allowed, even in the bitter cold of January and February, because it had become their place, sacred in its own way. In March, Ophelia realized she was pregnant. She told Yates one evening over supper, just stating it plainly between bites of pot roast, and he nearly choked on his food in surprise and joy. Are you certain? He managed to ask when he caught his breath. As certain as I can be without seeing a doctor, Ophelia said, and there was wonder in her voice. I am nearly 2 months along, I think. The baby should come in October. Yates came around the table and pulled her into his arms, burying his face in her hair. A baby, our baby. Ophelia, I cannot even begin to tell you how happy this makes me. She held him tight and he felt her trembling. I am terrified, she whispered. My mother died in childbirth with my brother, who also did not survive. What if the same happens to me? Yates pulled back to look at her sternly. We will get you the best care available. Doc Morrison is an excellent physician, and his wife is a trained midwife. We will take every precaution, and you will come through this just fine. Both of you. Over the following months, they prepared for the baby's arrival with a mixture of excitement and anxiety. Ophelia continued working at the boarding house, though Yates insisted she hire a girl to help with the heavier cleaning tasks. They converted the small storage room adjoining their bedroom into a nursery, painting the walls a cheerful yellow and building a cradle from pine boards. The lodgers, most of whom had grown fond of Ophelia over the years, contributed small gifts: a knitted blanket, a set of wooden rattles, a beautiful quilt sewn by the wife of one of the clerks. Summer arrived hot and dry, and Ophelia grew round with pregnancy, moving more slowly but never complaining. Yates worried constantly, watching her like a hawk for any sign of distress, but she remained healthy and strong. In the evenings, he would place his hand on her swollen belly and feel their child moving inside, and the reality of it would hit him like a physical blow. He was going to be a father. This tiny person would depend on him for everything. It was terrifying and wonderful in equal measure. In early October, with the aspens turning gold again and the air taking on that crystalline quality that presaged winter, Ophelia went into labor. It started in the middle of the night, a gasping awakening to pain, and Yates ran through the dark streets to fetch Doc Morrison and his wife, while one of the lodgers sat with Ophelia and tried to keep her calm. The labor lasted 14 hours, long, brutal hours, during which Yates paced the hallway outside their quarters and prayed to a God he was not entirely sure he believed in. He could hear Ophelia crying out, could hear Mrs. Morrison's calm voice coaching her through the contractions, and he felt utterly helpless, unable to do anything but wait and hope. Finally, as the October afternoon was fading into evening, he heard it, the thin, reedy wail of a newborn baby. Yates's knees nearly gave out from relief. A moment later, Mrs. Morrison opened the door, her face tired but smiling. "You have a son," she said, "a healthy, beautiful boy. And your wife did wonderfully. She is exhausted, but she is fine." Yates pushed past her into the room, barely registering Doc Morrison packing up his instruments or the bloodied linens being gathered up. All he could see was Ophelia, pale and sweat-soaked but smiling, cradling a tiny bundle wrapped in the blue blanket they had prepared. He stumbled to the bedside and sank into the chair there, unable to speak. "Meet your son," Ophelia said softly, and she shifted the baby so Yates could see his face. He was perfect, impossibly tiny and red-faced, with a shock of dark hair and eyes that were just beginning to open. Yates reached out with one trembling finger to stroke the baby's cheek, and the little one turned toward the touch instinctively, mouth opening. "He is beautiful," Yates managed to say through the tears streaming down his face. "You are both so beautiful. Ophelia, I love you so much." "I love you too," she said, and her own voice was thick with emotion. "What should we name him?" They had discussed names for months without reaching a decision. Now looking at his son's face, Yates knew with sudden certainty. "What was your father's name?" "You have never told me." Ophelia's expression softened. "Owen. Owen Patrick Hayes." "Then let us call him Owen," Yates said. "Owen Patrick Reilly," carrying both his grandfather's names forward. "Owen," Ophelia repeated, testing it out. "Yes, that is perfect." Doc Morrison and his wife left them alone after ensuring that both mother and child were stable and comfortable. The lodgers, who had been hovering anxiously in the hallway, came by one at a time to peek at the baby and offer congratulations before retreating to give the new family privacy. As full dark fell outside and the street lamps flickered to life, Yates and Ophelia sat together on their bed with their son between them, marveling at the miracle they had created. "Sing to him," Ophelia said. "Sing one of my grandmother's songs so he knows where he comes from." So Yates sang "The Blackbird's Lullaby," and then "The Rowan Tree," and then the first song Ophelia had ever taught him, that ancient nameless melody that her grandmother had learned from her grandmother, stretching back through generations of Irish women who had survived famine and war and ocean crossings. His voice was rough with exhaustion and emotion, but he sang every note true, and little Owen settled into sleep with a tiny sigh that seemed to contain all the peace in the world. The years that followed were full and rich. Owen grew from a colicky infant into a sturdy toddler, and then a bright, curious boy who followed his father around the ranch whenever Yates brought him along and peppered his mother with endless questions about everything. He had Ophelia's sage green eyes and Yates's dark hair, and his grandmother Siobhan's stubborn determination to master whatever caught his interest. When Owen was 3, Ophelia gave birth to twin girls, Clara and Rose, who had their mother's copper hair and their father's broad grin. The boarding house became a chaotic, joyful place, filled with the sound of children's laughter and running feet. Some of the lodgers moved on, preferring quieter accommodations, but others stayed and became unofficial uncles to the Reilly children, teaching them card games and whittling and how to shine shoes properly. Yates eventually stepped down from his foreman position at the Sullivan Ranch, though he continued to work there part-time as a horse trainer. The boarding house demanded more attention as their family grew, and he wanted to be present for his children's lives in a way his own father had never managed. Sullivan understood and found a new foreman, though he made it clear that Yates would always have a place at the ranch if he wanted it. As the children grew older, Ophelia taught them all their great-grandmother's songs, just as Siobhan had taught her. They would gather in the parlor on winter evenings, the boarding house lodgers invited to listen if they wished, and the voices would rise in those ancient melodies that spoke of loss and love and endurance. Owen learned quickly and had a clear, true voice. The twins preferred to harmonize, creating intricate counter melodies that made Ophelia weep with pride. On Sundays, when they could manage it, the whole family would go to the creek where Yates had first heard Ophelia singing. The children would play in the shallows under their parents' watchful eyes, and Yates would take Ophelia's hand and remember that moment 13 years ago when his life had changed forever, when he had stumbled upon a woman humming a song no one else knew and somehow found the courage to ask her to teach it to him. "Do you ever regret it?" Ophelia asked him one such Sunday afternoon in the summer of 1889. They were watching Owen, now nearly 13, teaching his 8-year-old sisters how to skip stones while the cottonwoods rustled overhead. "Tying yourself to me in all my complications?" Yates looked at her in astonishment. "Regret it? Ophelia, you and these children are the best thing that ever happened to me. You saved my life in every way that matters." She smiled, but there was a shadow in her eyes. "I just wonder sometimes if you would have been happier staying at the ranch full time, building your career there instead of splitting your time to help me with the boarding house." "I am exactly where I want to be," Yates said firmly. He pulled her close, wrapping his arm around her shoulders. "Do you remember what Sullivan told me before I proposed to you? He said the only real mistake is wasting the time we have by being too cautious to live. I have not wasted a single day with you, love. Not one." Ophelia leaned her head against his shoulder. "I love you, Yates Reilly. Even after all these years, it still takes my breath away sometimes, how much I love you." "The feeling is entirely mutual, Mrs. Reilly," he said, kissing the top of her head. Owen chose that moment to send a stone skipping 7 times across the creek's surface, and the twins shrieked with delight and demanded he teach them his technique. Yates and Ophelia laughed, watching their children splash and play in the cold, clear water, and the moment stretched out perfect and golden, a single bright point in the string of moments that made up a life well lived. As the children grew into teenagers and then young adults, they each found their own paths. Owen developed his father's gift with horses and eventually took over the training operation at the Sullivan Ranch, which had passed to Thomas's nephew after the old man died peacefully in his sleep at the age of 78. Clara discovered a talent for numbers and began handling the boarding house accounts, eventually expanding the business by purchasing 2 additional properties in Laramie. Rose inherited her great-grandmother's gift for healing and went to nursing school in Denver, returning to Laramie to work at the new hospital that had opened in 1895. Yates and Ophelia grew older together, their hair turning gray, their faces acquiring the lines and creases of lives fully lived. The boarding house became something of a Laramie institution, known for its cleanliness, good food, and the sound of Irish music drifting from the parlor on quiet evenings. Travelers would specifically request rooms there, and more than one person remarked that staying at Riley's boarding house felt like coming home. On their 25th wedding anniversary in December of 1901, their children and grandchildren gathered to celebrate. Owen had married a rancher's daughter and given them three grandchildren. Clara had married the son of a local banker and had two children of her own. Rose remained single by choice, devoted to her nursing work, but she was a beloved aunt who spoiled all her nieces and nephews terribly. They held the party in the boarding house dining room, which was decorated with evergreen boughs and candles. There was a feast, there were toasts, there were embarrassing stories from the children's youth that made everyone laugh. And at the end of the evening, after the grandchildren had been carried upstairs to bed and the guests had departed, Ophelia stood in the middle of the empty dining room and began to hum. It was the first song Yates had ever heard her sing, that nameless ancient melody that her grandmother Siobhan had learned from her grandmother, stretching back through centuries of Irish women who had survived everything the world threw at them. Yates joined in immediately, his voice rougher now with age, but still true, and one by one their children added their voices as well. Even the grandchildren who were still awake crept down the stairs to listen, sensing something sacred in the moment. When the song ended, there was a long moment of profound silence. Then Owen, now a man of 26 with his father's build and his mother's eyes, spoke up. "Tell us again, Ma. Tell us about great-grandmother Siobhan and how these songs came down to us." So Ophelia told the stories she had told 100 times before, but which never grew old. She spoke of County Cork and the famine, of coffin ships and the long journey west, of a woman tough as leather who had lived through impossible things and passed her strength down through her songs. She spoke of the night Siobhan died, singing with her last breath to ensure that the music would not die with her. "These songs are your inheritance," Ophelia said, looking around at her children and grandchildren. "They are the one thing no one can take from you, the one possession that travels light. As long as you remember them and teach them to your children, your great-grandmother will never truly die. Her voice will echo down through the generations, a reminder that we come from survivors, from people who refused to break no matter what the world did to them." The grandchildren listened with wide eyes, too young to fully understand, but old enough to sense the importance of what they were hearing. Yates watched his wife in the candlelight, still seeing in her the young woman he had found humming by a creek 27 years ago, and his heart swelled with love so intense it was almost painful. Later that night, alone in their bedroom with the house finally quiet around them, Ophelia and Yates lay in the darkness and talked about the life they had built together. "Do you remember the day we met?" Ophelia asked, her voice soft in the dark. "You said you had never heard anything like my singing." "I remember everything about that day," Yates said. "The way the light caught in your hair, the way you did not flinch when my gun went off, the way that song pulled at something inside me that I thought was dead." "I almost did not come back the next Sunday," Ophelia confessed. "I was so frightened of letting anyone get close again. But something about you made me brave enough to try." "I am glad you did," Yates said fervently. "I am glad every single day." They fell asleep holding hands, the way they had every night for 25 years, and the songs of Ophelia's grandmother seemed to drift through the quiet house like a blessing. The new century brought changes to Laramie and to the Reilly family. The Wild West they had known was disappearing, replaced by automobiles and electric lights and telephones. Wyoming achieved statehood in 1890, and the rough frontier town where Yates and Ophelia had met became increasingly civilized with paved streets and modern amenities. But some things remained constant. Every Sunday that weather allowed, Yates and Ophelia still went to their creek, though they moved more slowly now, and sometimes needed Owen's arm to navigate the rocky path down to the water. The cottonwoods still rustled in the breeze, and the water still ran cold and clear, and they would sit on their old flat rock and hum their songs together. In the spring of 1908, Yates fell ill with pneumonia. At 63, his body no longer bounced back from illness the way it once had, and despite Doc Morrison's best efforts and Rose's devoted nursing, it became clear that he was not going to recover. He spent his last days in the brass bed where all three of his children had been conceived, surrounded by family, drifting in and out of consciousness. Ophelia rarely left his side. She held his hand and sang to him all the songs her grandmother had taught her, all the songs they had learned together over nearly 3 decades of marriage. The children took turns sitting vigil, and the grandchildren came to say goodbye, tearful and confused by the idea that their strong, gentle grandfather was leaving them. On a May morning, when the world outside was bursting with spring growth and new life, Yates opened his eyes and found Ophelia's face above his. "I love you," he managed to whisper. "Always have, always will." "I love you too," Ophelia said, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you for teaching me that I could open my heart again. Thank you for every day we had together." Yates smiled, and it was peaceful. "Sing for me? That first song, the one I heard by the creek?" So Ophelia sang, her voice cracking with grief but still true, and Yates closed his eyes and let the ancient melody carry him away. He died just as the sun broke fully over the mountains, his hand clasped in his wife's, surrounded by the people he loved most in the world. The grief nearly broke Ophelia. For weeks after the funeral, she moved through the boarding house like a ghost, barely eating, hardly speaking. Her children worried desperately, seeing in her the same dangerous retreat from life that had nearly claimed their father all those years ago. It was Clara who finally broke through to her, sitting her mother down in the parlor and speaking with uncharacteristic bluntness. "Ma, you have to come back to us," she said. "I know you are in pain. We all are. But Pa would not want this. He would want you to keep living, to keep singing, to keep passing on Grandmother Siobhan's songs. You taught us that these songs are about survival, about refusing to break. So do not break now, Ma. Please." Something in Clara's words reached through the fog of Ophelia's grief. She looked around at her children, all of them adults now with families of their own, and saw Yates reflected in their faces, in Owen's dark hair and strong hands, in Clara's sharp mind and warm heart, in Rose's gentle compassion. He was not truly gone as long as they carried pieces of him forward. "You are right," Ophelia said, and her voice was stronger than it had been in weeks. "I am sorry for frightening you all. I will try to do better." It was not easy, learning to live without Yates. The boarding house felt empty despite being full of lodgers, and the bed they had shared for 27 years was too large and too cold. But Ophelia forced herself to get up each morning, to do her work, to engage with the world, and slowly, painfully, she began to heal. She found solace in her grandchildren, who were growing up so fast it made her head spin. She taught them all their great-great-grandmother's songs, passing the music down one more generation. She took them to the creek on Sundays and told them stories about their grandfather, keeping his memory alive through words and melody. Owen took over management of the boarding house when Clara and her husband moved to Cheyenne for his banking career, and Rose moved back home to help care for her mother as Ophelia's health began to decline. In the evenings, the three of them would sit in the parlor, and Ophelia would sing while Owen played the guitar he had taught himself in his youth, and Rose hummed harmony. Ophelia lived another 12 years after Yates died, 12 years of watching her grandchildren grow into adults and welcoming great-grandchildren into the world. She was 87 years old when she finally followed her husband into whatever came next, passing away peacefully in her sleep on a winter night in 1920. At her funeral, held in the Methodist church where she and Yates had married nearly 40 years earlier, the family gathered to say goodbye. Owen spoke about his mother's strength and kindness. Clara talked about her business acumen and her fierce love for family. Rose described her compassion and her healing touch. And then at Owen's signal, the entire family stood and sang. They sang The Blackbird's Lullaby and The Weaver's Lament and The Three Riddles. They sang The Rowan Tree and a dozen other songs that Siobhan had taught Ophelia all those years ago in Kansas. And finally, they sang that first nameless melody, the one that was older than memory, the one that spoke of endings and beginnings tangled up together. The church was packed with people who had known Ophelia, people whose lives she had touched in small and large ways. And as the music filled the space, rising up to the rafters and spilling out into the cold Wyoming air, more than one person remarked that they could hear three voices singing together: Ophelia's clear soprano, Yates's rough baritone, and underneath it all, an older woman's voice with an Irish lilt, the voice of a survivor who had crossed an ocean and lived through impossible things. Owen kept the boarding house running for another 15 years before finally selling it to one of his sons. The building still stands in Laramie to this day, converted now into apartments, but locals swear that sometimes on quiet Sunday afternoons, if you stand very still and listen carefully, you can hear the faint sound of singing drifting from the upper windows. Ancient Irish melodies sung by voices that refuse to be silenced by something as simple as death. The songs themselves live on, passed down through 5 generations now of Reilly descendants. Every one of them learns the Blackbird's Lullaby as a child, and many of them have learned the other songs as well. They gather for reunions every few years, these scattered children of Wyoming, and they sing together, keeping alive the memory of a woman named Ophelia, who learned music from her grandmother Siobhan, who learned it from her grandmother, who learned it from hers, stretching back through time to women whose names have been forgotten but whose voices echo still. And in Laramie, there is a historical marker now at the creek where Yates and Ophelia first met, placed there by the local historical society at the family's request. It tells the story of two broken people who found each other beside moving water, who built a life together, one song at a time, who proved that love can heal even the deepest wounds if you are brave enough to let it in. The creek still runs cold and clear, and the cottonwoods still rustle in the breeze. And if you stand there on a Sunday afternoon in any season, you can almost hear it: a man and a woman singing together, their voices blending in perfect harmony, a melody older than memory, carrying forward into the future, a testament to the power of love and music, and the stubborn refusal of the human spirit to be broken by anything the world can throw at it. This is how stories survive. This is how love endures. This is how two people who had every reason to give up on happiness found each other instead, and in finding each other, found a reason to believe in tomorrow. Their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren carry that legacy forward, living proof that even in the hardest times, even when the world seems determined to grind you down, there is still room for joy and hope and songs that no one else knows but you. And somewhere, in whatever comes after this life, Yates and Ophelia are still singing together, still learning new verses to add to the old melodies, still falling in love all over again with every sunrise, because that is what they do, what they have always done. They survive, they love, they sing, and the music goes on.